Good morning. It's Friday, and I'm here with another episode 27 to be precise, if I haven't got my numbers screwed up, which is always possible with me. But we're talking with Joti Brar about imperialism. We got a number of things to talk about, including this so-called left in the imperialist countries that always seem to have a motivation to support these decadent wars. Let's talk. Good afternoon. It's Friday, and we're going to have another discussion with Joti Brar. Always a lot of fun. We all learn a lot from Joti. Joti is and are you the director of the Communist Party? What's your chair?
I'm the vice chair.
Vice chair.
Until our next Congress, when who knows?
The vice chair. Well, maybe you can do like South Korea, and you can declare martial law in your party and just tell everybody that you're the boss.
Elections have been abolished. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it seems to be going on a lot these days in the imperialist countries. That's what they have to do to protect democracy. You see, South Korea has democracy. North Korea is a terrible, evil communist country. Let's not forget that. So anyway. Something before we get going, I wanted to throw something at you, something that I thought you may have valuable comments, valuable insight, and that is earlier, during the election here in the United States, we heard a lot about, January 6th, the Democratic Party. January 6th, it was an insurrection. They tried to, overthrow our democracy, right? And a lot of people like me saw this as the ruling elite or their proxies saying, oh my gosh, a bunch of unwashed working class people wandered in here, albeit I may disagree with a lot of them, all of them ideologically, most of them, but they're working class people, and they were pissed for whatever reason, and they wandered into Congress, and they made this a point of the election, but it didn't go anywhere. I mean, they still lost in a blowout. And when you talk to people on the street, if you say January 6th, they'd be like, yeah. You know what I mean? When you talk to people anecdotally, I'm big on that with politics. I talk to people and just see what normal, everyday people think. And it seems to never fail me when I'm predicting politics. And people are like, gee, Garland, you're pretty good at predicting. I'm like, well, not really. I just talk to like people on the street, and whatever they tell me, I'm like, yeah, it's probably the direction it's going to go. I don't have some secret formula. But at any rate, here's what I have to say. And a lot of these ruling elite people were really shocked. Well, how come people weren't upset that people were coming in threatening members of Congress? So recently we had this incident in New York where some guy walked up behind one of these CEOs that's making tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, shot him in the back. And of course, we didn't know what to expect online. But what we've seen overwhelmingly is people venting their anger at the ruling elite. People saying, who cares? That company kills a lot of people. And they you had people putting their stories online. Yes, they wouldn't approve this from my mother, my son, my father. They took this, they made us pay this. People talking about the pain. And then it dawned on me, well, no wonder they weren't upset about January 6th. They're ready to pull out the guillotine. Literally. I mean, I can be facetious about it, but when people see a member of who they identify as a member of the ruling elite get shot, and they literally cheer and start pointing out how they're being screwed by the ruling elite, how long people say there's going to be a civil war, and I say it'll look a whole lot more like the French Revolution than the Civil War of the 1860s, right? Your thoughts on what we can learn from this fury of online fury, Joti?
Thanks, Garland. I think you're right. What you've seen online is an outpouring of anger, which we're aware from so many things is constantly bubbling below the surface of our apparently peaceful and stable societies in the West, right? On the top, things seem to carry on as normal, but underneath, because life is getting constantly worse and more stressful and more difficult for ordinary people, and increasing numbers of them, even ones who live relatively decently, the stress they're under, the insecurity they suffer from about their ability to keep their life together and keep it going, and the paycheck to paycheck situation, which isn't just the poorest, it's even, quite into the, better off sections of the workforce who would appear on the surface to be living a nice life. It's held together by a thread, as it were, and a lot of people feeling that stress and that pressure and that insecurity, which is very difficult to live with in a chronic way. Stress is something, the health professionals will tell you, stress is something that in short bursts is beneficial and natural in life and can spur you on to great achievements. But chronic stress destroys you, destroys your health, destroys your mentality, just chips away at your resilience and your ability to, function as a proper human being. So that chronic chipping away at people through chronic stress is leading to a huge amount of angst, anxiety, stress, anger, frustration, and it bubbles away beneath the surface, and it's getting incrementally worse. So it's interesting to see what will make it burst out at any particular moment. And we see regularly these days moments where that anger bursts out, and that kind of online display of anger at the profiteers, people who make their money through profiteering of the poverty, sucking money out of the working class, and literally, this is how the system works. This is how the ruling class have their money. They have their wealth because they suck it from the labor and the income of the working class. And, they are rich because we are poor. That is how the system works, right? But there are certain aspects of our social life and privatized medical care is one of those ones which is really in your face, that relationship, right? I mean, going all the way back to Nixon, the understanding on the ruling class's part that, okay, so the less we pay out in care, the more money we make. And that's been explicitly understood by the president and by the ruling elites, as well as by the corporations, right? There's a general understanding that this is how the care system works. This is how the money is made. And the politicians get kickbacks for keeping that situation going and underpinning all of the US discussions about Medicare and all the rest of it, Medicaid, whatever. There's an understanding that whatever, small benefits we give to some poor sections of the working class, it's based in this same maths, right? We will overpay and underdeliver, and that is how we make mega profits, right? And of course, that's where monopoly also comes into it. When you have monopoly providers, they're able to pay or charge extra because they're the only provider of the service, and deliver absolutely as little as possible because you can't go anywhere else. There is no competition in the market that we're always told is why capitalism is best. But monopoly capitalism's the opposite. The competition in the market has been got rid of, right? And so the monopolies literally just rinse the coffers of the treasury of the people to make their profits. In many ways, I'm surprised that a hit like this, a frustrated, angry person hasn't done something like this before. This was clearly a planned operation by the assassin, and nobody had to think about why he would have done it. There's no big inquest everywhere. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing? It's obvious to everybody. And the reason it's obvious is because so many people suffer so badly from exactly what you were describing, Garland. Literally, that the insurance companies will do everything possible not to pay, or to pay as little as possible. And ordinary people are either bankrupted or die for lack of care that when they thought they had insurance cover, right? These are not even the uninsured. We're talking about people who thought they had insurance. But it turns out, although they've been paying all their lives, when they need it, they don't get it. I remember something similar. My mother was a solicitor in Britain, that's a lawyer, but of the legal aid type, right? So she was always working in fields back in the days where working class people had the right to help from the state to pay for legal costs. It's mostly been abolished now, but my mum worked in legal aid law, which was like where you don't make lots of money. And she was a solicitor, And at one point in her career, she was working in a personal injury field. Now, personal injury law was something that really ballooned as our health service started to get worse and worse. Because when you increasingly don't have a decent health service, you start to get into the litigation culture, the insurance and suing culture, and the need to have a big payout if you have a bad injury because the health service isn't going to cover you. It's like housing law really ballooned after we started British government started privatizing social housing, and it was possible for British people to be made homeless by being evicted, and they would have no home because the council no longer had the duty to rehouse them in a council house. So suddenly you have this whole section of law, emerges as a result of people fighting being evicted because they're going to be homeless, all the rest of it. So my mum was working in personal injury law, and she would tell me how difficult it was as the small person in the case. You would have somebody fighting a company. They'd have a situation where there was some negligence of a company or a corporation to blame for an accident that left them with lifelong medical needs or disabilities or inability to work, or whatever it might be. And they would be trying to get compensation from that company. And she said, that in many, many cases, the claimant, although the case was perfectly justified and correct, and they needed the money, they would end up being worn down and either giving up or settling for a terrible payment because the insurance of the big company that they're going up against have loads of lawyers whose job it is to quibble and slow down the process and make it so painful and difficult that people give up and go away. And that's literally their job. They pay expensive lawyers to just pettifog and slow everything down. And you imagine you're the little person on the other end who's desperate for this money. And it's just the same thing we're talking about here with your people who don't get their health insurance payouts, right? Their life is being made a misery. They are literally being kind of tortured to death, for the sake of the profits of big corporations. And they know it. They are powerless in that equation, and they know it. So it's not surprising that many, many people saw this, understood perfectly what the motivation was, and didn't feel particularly shocked or angry about it. In fact, lots of people I saw were sort of celebrating. The problem is, of course, ultimately, it doesn't get us anywhere. That guy is going to be replaced. CEOs of big companies are not difficult to replace. There's another one waiting in the wings. The company will carry on behaving exactly the same way. The dynamic remains. Okay, more CEOs will hire bodyguards. There will be better policing of these types of events. A certain section of the better off workers will be made to feel, our democracy is under threat. There's assassins loose on the street. But fundamentally, nothing's changed. And it reminds me very much, actually, of the Narodnik movement in Russia in the 19th century. So in the pre-revolutionary Russia, but revolutionary sentiments were rising amongst the Russian people because, they had a really repressive Tsarist regime, an autocracy that was very, very strangulating in terms of the people's personal liberties. They worked and lived in terrible conditions, whether they were peasants or proletarians, factory workers. Their conditions were really appalling. There was corporal punishment, for all kinds of really minor offences. And workers were regularly kind of shot for going on strike and that sort of thing. But at that time, the peasants were the major section of the Russian population. And out of the peasant revolutionary movement, there came this group called People's Will, Narodnaya Volya, I think it is. Sorry to the Russians if I said that wrong. And their approach was terrorism. They said, if we throw bombs at high officials, if we assassinate the Tsar and his ministers, that will persuade the people to rise up. And they kind of had this theory that the mob has to be led by an elite, and they can't really be educated, they're too backward, but we can rouse them to action if we lead them. And the way to lead them is to kind of incite them with energy and fury via these kind of acts of terror. And of course, it didn't work. And although they did have some successful high-profile assassinations, they weren't able to mobilize the people that way. Fundamentally, and Lenin's brother was actually executed for his part in assassination of a Tsar in the 1880s, I want to say. Apologies again if I'm getting my dates wrong. So it was his older brother. And Lenin criticized that movement. He said, they had a lot of really good revolutionary sentiments, and their ideal of wanting to make a revolution and mobilize the people was right, but they had the wrong way of going about it. And the main reason they were wrong was because they didn't have a scientific understanding of society that you can get from Marxism. And fundamentally, they didn't recognize that the people can be mobilized and organized. The mass of the poor in the towns and the countryside can be organized and mobilized to make the revolution themselves and to take hold of society. And of course, that's what the October Revolution did in 1917. And I think it's really useful to look back at our history and understand these things, that these sentiments are often there, and they're an expression of the fact that this society is really rotten ripe for overthrow. There are so many people who feel the injustice of the present system. And, Engels, Friedrich Engels, who was the co-founder of scientific socialism with Marx, back in the 1870s, he wrote, when a large number of people really feel that society is unjust, it's a sign that all the elements of the new society already exist. We already have everything we need to go forward into socialism. We have these means of mass production. We have a massive working class that has no vested interest in the system. That working class's job is to get rid of the present state of things, bring down the state of oppression, create a new state that's for the majority, and plan an economy based on using these massive means of production that already exist, that are capable of giving a good life to everybody. We now feel it's utterly disgusting to see all this inequality in society. And the reason that feels disgusting is because it's totally irrational at this point in time. It's unnecessary. We can deliver a good life using the technology available to human beings now. A good life can be delivered to every person on the planet. Why on earth do we have this situation where the majority of humanity continues to get poorer when the means to solve that problem has been in our hands for more than 100 years? This is why people burn with injustice, because this society is no longer capable of delivering anything useful. In fact, it's obviously holding us back.
Wow. The other thing I wanted to say, we've got time, so I think this is an important issue. I was talking to someone recently, a young couple, and they were basically saying, yeah, it's about time. What you hear so much among particularly the young, right? But they connected it to something totally different. And they were saying, basically, they pay $3,000 a month for their, two husband, wife, and one small child. They pay $3,000 a month for their rent for their home. Okay. They were trying to buy a home. That the payment for the home to purchase was less than $3,000 a month. But the bank wouldn't approve them, basically saying, oh, you can't afford to pay that. And they said, well, maybe on paper, but we've been paying it. We've never missed a payment. We've been paying it for a year and a half now, and it's about to go up January 1st, and we want to buy because we're going to have to pay more. And we'd rather pay less, and we can do it. And they wouldn't do it. And they had been to the car deal. And now you see cars, everything's $50,000, literally 60 pickup trucks. People who drive pickup trucks cannot afford an $80,000 pickup truck, but that's what they are. And now the companies are starting to lay off people because it's weird. You're watching the companies sell these cars and trucks with these exorbitant prices. Nobody's buying them. It seems like the company doesn't know what to do. Like they're like, but we've got to make them. We've got to have these prices. And you see the car companies dying. So people are angry. They can't buy a house. They can't buy a car. And they look at that and they connected that to their situation. They didn't even say, well, we have any health problems, but they just told me, yeah, I know how they feel. You know what I mean?
Yes. I mean, people are in the Western countries, people got used to the idea that they could expect a secure life with certain things as a given. That, if you worked hard at school and got out and got a job, there would be a job for you and it would pay you properly, and you would be able to have 2.4 children and a 3-bedroom semi-detached house and a car and a holiday once a year. And those things were kind of just guaranteed and expected. And you would have some leisure time and the ability to go for walks in the country or learn to play the piano or whatever the thing, you know, go and play on the bowling green, whatever the thing was that you were interested in, you'd have time and the ability to access it. And that was the deal that was made with the workers in the West after World War II to stop them making the revolution. It was the product of a very particular period. It was a product of the time when the Soviet Union was socially outperforming the world and showing what socialism can deliver to the people. And the imperialists were trying, you know, they were battered in Europe after World War I and II. They were trying to get back on their feet. They needed social peace at home in order to push down harder on the colonies and in order to kind of just rebuild themselves and recover. And they needed to buy off the revolutionary sentiments of their people, which we've talked about before, Garland, were very, very high. Remember that it was the communists and the communist partisans, the communist resistors, who won the war in every theatre across the world from west to east. In every theatre, it was directly a communist army or a communist-led partisan movement which was responsible for the victory over fascism everywhere. And that's on top of the fact that the huge economic and social achievements of the Soviet Union during the 1930s had become apparent to workers all over the world. So that combination was extremely powerful. You know, the most respected, looked up to person on the planet at that moment in time was Joseph Stalin, right? And with good reason. And so this was the situation in which those concessions were granted. But, you know, the capitalists give with one hand and take away with the other. As they were making this peace deal, they made sure to thoroughly corrupt and decapitate the communist movements in their home countries. And during the period when the economic crisis was coming back and they were starting to take away what they had granted and chip away at it, initially slowly and then increasingly rapidly, they had managed to engineer a situation in which the communists had been entirely bought off and corrupted, to the point where all of them, in every Western country, the main Communist Party had adopted a policy, and of course it was led by the revisionist Soviet Union, also had a similar policy which said there is a way to get to socialism that doesn't involve class struggle, that doesn't involve the revolution, that just means quietly socialism will outcompete capitalism and the imperialists will just have to give up and go away. And, you know, in fact, I was speaking to a comrade from Berlin, and he works with the GDR archives, you know, the archives of the former German Democratic Republic, communist East Germany. And he was telling me, you know, there was this, it was a socialist state that delivered such huge benefits to its people and really in many ways was one of the more militant of the socialist states in the Eastern European bloc. But because they had adopted these kind of Khrushchevite revisionist ideological positions, even while they were trying to stand up for the planned economy, they were saying Khrushchevite, stupid, pacifist things like, really right into the 80s, right up until the day when DDR just kind of collapsed, they were still kind of saying, we will just peacefully outcompete the West. And, you know, there's no scientific basis for that. Lenin and Stalin repeatedly said after the revolution, the class struggle intensifies, it doesn't go away, because you still have this class of people who are desperate to regain their lost paradise. And you know, the revolution is the beginning of a process. It's not the end of the process by any means. So it's really important to kind of recognize those things. And maybe you have to bring me back to what our starting point was for the question.
Well, let's do this, because here's an interesting article that also segues us into our next conversation. NATO tells members to divert social spending, doggone it, all of those things for the poor little people. For militaries, security, I like that word, comes above all that else. The security of having food and a roof over my head and healthcare and an education and a job, the working class consider that security. They consider it war. European members of NATO need to cut welfare and direct more of their GDP to the military-industrial complex in the name of safety. I know spending more on defense means spending less on other priorities, but it's only a little less. As you're in the UK, I don't have to tell you, you see what's happening here and how things are falling apart. So my point is here, it takes us where we want to go. You have people calling themselves democratic socialist, the left, never saw a war that they didn't love. This year, they're like, in America, in 2020 in here, now these are the so-called left. We've got to support Biden because the alternative, Biden, these warmongering imperialist fruitcake racist scum like Biden. So we've got this so-called left who they, now they're, Assad was a dictator. Maduro, now the imperialists are threatening Maduro. Well, Bernie Sanders, Maduro's a dictator. So your thoughts on this business about the so-called left in the imperialist countries? In my opinion, they are the biggest hurdle. They are the worst because they're the infiltrators. They're the spies in the camp. They're the ones who are there to pretend as though if you're a Democrat, we still have a left flank there that we can still possibly take control of the Democrat and steer it. Joti, your thoughts?
100%, Garland. The self-proclaimed left in the imperialist countries, as a result of this process that's actually been going on since World War I, this buying off of the leadership and a privileged section of the working class. And during the post-World War II period, that section that was bought off was massively expanded. And now we're seeing this process that's what's creating all this indignation that you were talking about of people's stress and poverty, impoverishment. They might not be in absolute poverty, but they're becoming impoverished relatively to where they were, and it's getting worse. The trajectory is only down, and this is because there's a narrowing back again of the section of the working class that the ruling class can afford to or feels it's necessary to buy off. And so the condition for the masses compared to the condition for the small section of bought off people is becoming once more very, very different and very obviously different and unequal. But yes, this situation where we have this fake lift, the leadership of the trade unions, the leadership of all the official working class organizations and the section of bought off people who they come from and really speak for are absolutely our enemy within. And you couldn't get a better example of that than seeing the response of people to what just happened in Syria. While anybody with a brain is breaking their heart for what is being done to Syria, brave Syria that stood up to nearly 14 years of non-stop, dirty, hybrid, all fronts war, right? Everything done to Syria to torture the people and destroy the country from so many directions, jihadi, takfiri, fascist terrorist invasion, Turkish occupation, American occupation, Kurdish proxies used, and all of these forces used to terrorize the people, to break the country into pieces, to starve the people with economic sanctions, and to starve them by cutting off their most important resources, which are in the northeast. The oil and the wheat fields of Syria have been occupied directly by the USA and by their Turkish proxies, Kurdish proxies up that way, as well as the constant threat of terrorists which have invaded and been pushed back and invaded and been pushed back, and then this huge, as well as an all-out sanctions blitzkrieg for all this time, which has been really strangulating the Syrian economy and the people. Then there's also been what was I just going to say? I can't remember. Anyway, so there's this sanctions blitzkrieg, all these different types of attack on Syria that they've been enduring, and finally they managed to hollow out the Syrian economy to such an extent and to buy off, it looks like, a section of the Syrian state and the Syrian army to the point where those still loyal to Syria, those still loyal to the army, were not in a position to hold the line anymore, and it simply collapsed. And that is a terrible, terrible crime against the people. They have endured so much. And now their country is going to be torn to pieces by head-chopping fascists who the West is trying to hold up as democrats. And the people who have the gall to applaud that, they are either paid or stupid servants of imperialism, and they are our enemies. Nobody should be under any illusion about the role these people play. They are cheerleading for the imperialist destruction of a country. And let's just think about what Syria was and why it was targeted. Syria is the one country in the Middle East that throughout the period of Israel's existence refused to ever normalize relations. It never accepted the Zionist project, ever. Syria was the country where every single Palestinian armed faction and political faction was enabled to operate and have its headquarters. Syria was the one country where Palestinian refugees were treated as citizens and human beings and not as a kind of Untermenschen, annoyance that was to be treated just as a political football and a permanently cheap source of labor. Syria was the place where Palestinians were treated with dignity. Syria was always the hinterland for the Palestinian resistance, always. Whatever difficulties have, there've been ups and downs in the history of every Arab country because of imperialism and the lines it draws and the interference it runs and the way it sets factions up against one another and tries to, fund this movement against that movement. There's a history of, Baathism, was originally a kind of national movement that was supported by the imperialists against the communists, because their main worry was back in the day, after World War II, the Middle East was full of secular communist forces who wanted to fight a liberation struggle that would bring a united Arabia, essentially, a greater, the whole region, Arab region, would be, their mission was one big united Arab Republic for all the Middle Eastern peoples, secular and socialist. And the imperialists worked exceptionally hard to have as many of those forces physically liquidated as possible. I mean, massacres of communists happened in literally every country in the Middle East during the post-war period, right up until the 70s. That was going on systematically. So sometimes the imperialists would back nationalist secular forces to undermine and turn them against the communists. But whatever the ups and downs, Syria has been the best friend to Palestine in the Middle East, and a very, very important, strategically where it's sat physically. We know, of course, that they're one of the supply routes to Hezbollah has been through Syria. Don't buy into the idea that now they can just be starved out and that's the end of the resistance axis. I don't buy it for a second. The resistance axis remains and it will come back. And I'm starting to see rumors, and it's very, it seems very plausible to me that there will be a Syrian resistance movement growing up quite quickly. And Syria is going to descend now into total chaos. All those people who thought maybe life will get better because it's been so bad, and maybe that's all because we've insisted on keeping Bashar al-Assad's government in place, and maybe if we let it go, things will get better. They're going to find exactly the opposite. Not only are they going to be terrorized and pogroms unleashed against everybody who's got the wrong type of religion, whether it's the wrong type of Islam or just not Islam at all those communities are going to find themselves terrorized and targeted. And there's horrific footage already circulating on the internet, if you've got the stomach for that sort of thing, of people being summarily executed. These jihadis are the worst kind of people. They are people who've been picked up from, back slums all over the world, who are basically up for being paid to be a gangster. And they brainwash them. They give them this takfiri ideology. It's the same as the Banderites in Ukraine. You take people who've been let down by the education system and you brainwash them with a supremacist ideology, and then you put a gun in one hand and a couple of $1,000s in the other hand, and you send them in that direction, and you give them total impunity. You can terrorize these people as much as you like. You will have impunity. In fact, you will be praised in our media and on the world stage for doing it. And so they give license to people to treat the rest of the world, like garbage, in order to do the dirty work of US imperialism. US imperialism at various times has pretended to fight ISIS, but really it's just about mobilizing different proxy armies and creating narrative control and breaking Syria into pieces, dividing the people that would have been on the Syrian government side. So separating the Kurds off from being part of the Syrian government forces into something separate, making them feel that, okay, we're fighting ISIS, but you're fighting ISIS next to the USA. Why do you think that's happening when the USA created ISIS? It's happening because they want to separate Syria into pieces, and they've promised you a peace in return for this fight. And do you know what? All you've done is help destroy Syria, and now your little republic is going to be destroyed too. And Syria is going to be turned into a battleground, just like Libya was. There's going to be no stable Syrian state. There's going to be no rebuilding Syrian institutions. These gangsters can't build institutions. What do they know about it? And not only that, now we see, what is Israel doing right now? And again, Israel doesn't act. Israel doesn't act without the green light from the USA. They are bombing not only every military piece of infrastructure and manufacturing capability, but every type of manufacturing capability whatsoever. Why is that, Garland? The reason is they want to make sure Syria has no capability to stand on its own feet. It's totally dependent. It has to give its oil wealth to the West and in return receive Western products. It has to rely on imports for everything to feed its people and clothe them and provide them with all the necessities of life, because then it's very, very hard to be sovereign. Even if they lose control of whichever government is in Damascus, they can always strangle them if they're not growing their own food and they're not producing their own basic goods and they don't have any military capacity or defense capacity. It's all been destroyed. This is not an accident. This is absolutely purposeful destruction of the ability of Syria to act as a sovereign nation. And that will take a long time to rebuild, even after such a time as the Syrian people have managed to regain their sovereignty, and who knows how long that will be. But, imagine, that in 2 years' time, some resistance movement had come and, reorganized itself and brought back sovereignty. They would still be in a totally weak position because of how all their infrastructure, all their military capability has been destroyed, or is in the process of being destroyed right now. So if people thought that if anybody in Syria was really celebrating, thinking, oh, now we're going to be free from the strangulating effect of the sanctions, they're about to find just how misled they've been. And my heart absolutely breaks for Syria after everything it's endured. And I really thought, Garland, along with so many people, that after China engineered the rapprochement, seemed to engineer a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it, Bashar al-Assad went to China and visited with Xi Jinping, and it was readmitted to the Gulf by the Gulf autocracies. What's their thing?
Yes, the Gulf. Yeah, it was a Gulf Council. Whatever. Yeah. Then
I really thought, oh, the war is over and Syria has won. And so it's been particularly, horrific to see how behind the scenes and under the surface, this internal rot had been carrying on, because ultimately this wasn't a great military victory. This was really, the groundwork was prepared by the sanctions, which just destroyed the people. And we mustn't forget that because of the sanctions, I met a Lebanese communist this year, and we were discussing, and he said, Syria has endured a genocide. And I asked him, what did he mean by that? He said, all the young men have left the country to find work because the economy is so broken by sanctions. So the people left behind, they're sending remittances back to help their families, but they have to go away. So there's no local labor force. There's no local, people are able to fill the army and do the work that needs doing. And so again, you know, even if they start to get help, you know, it's very difficult to rebuild if you don't have all your young men around, right? So they've become hyper exploitable labor in, you know, other countries, and their own country is just totally dependent on the money they send back. Their families can't survive without it. So Syria has endured so much, and the way that the fake left talks about it is utterly disgusting. Now, I used to go to Stop the War meetings back in the days when I was allowed to in Britain. And for years, we would listen every meeting. Some Trotskyite would get up and talk about how there was a people's revolution going on in Iran or Syria or Libya. And they would always tell us this, Garland, they're setting up workers' councils. Number one, it was always a lie. Number two, no one ever admitted that they'd lied. Number three, they always trot out the same lie the next time the imperialists are starting their colour revolution attempt against some country, their regime change operation. They're gearing up to invade, and they engender some protest movement on the street and blow it up out of all proportion in their media. And the Trotskyites will always get up in the left-wing movement and tell you how there's a mass movement, rebellion, revolt of the people against a dictatorial government that just so happens to be one the imperialists want to bring down. And there's a people's revolt happening, and the government's trying to suppress it, and the government's really terrible and evil. And they basically reinforce imperialist propaganda about this evil government that we have to bring down because we're nice and they're horrible. And actually, we're doing it for the benefit of their people. And these people in our anti-war meetings would stand up and spout this propaganda endlessly. And then at the end of saying all of that, we'll go, oh, but bombing's not the answer. But they basically said that the war is for a just cause. The imperialists are fighting a just war, and the government that they're trying to get rid of needs to be got rid of. It's the enemy of the people, right? And then all they're quibbling about is the tactics. But with this way of propagandizing on behalf of imperialism, you know, the fake left essentially demobilizes the working class and stops it mounting a meaningful anti-war action. Now, is it all right if I talk a bit more about that specific?
Certainly, keep going.
This is something really, really important, Garland, because when I was hearing about the fall of Syria, apart from, you know, just feeling heartbroken for Syria and everything it's now about to endure, and everything, you know, the doubling down of its, you know, the intensifying of its suffering that's so awful to think about, what I also felt was rage against our own people, because our movement has failed our allies. The people in Syria are facing forces sent by our ruling class, and we have allowed that to happen. We did nothing. And, you know, sometimes, Garland, I get really frustrated by what I call the professional commentariat. You know, even the ones on the left, even the ones you enjoy watching and think they've got good things to say, there comes a point where this looking at world politics like it's a baseball game and you're cheering for your team, and they're all there lining up to say what Syria did wrong, what Iran did wrong, what Russia did wrong. And do you know what none of them are talking about? What they didn't do. They're all acting like it's nothing to do with them, and we all have just no power. We're just observers watching a football game saying, oh, this guy didn't do the right move, this guy didn't do the right move, Russia's let Syria down, Iran's let Syria down, Assad was rotten and useless, it's because he's a bourgeois, it's because he's this, it's because he's that, he was corrupt, he wasn't corrupt, he was stupid, whatever. Do you know what? We in the West let our ruling classes get away with these crimes time after time after time and act as if there's nothing we could do. And I really want people to understand that that is not true. There is something we could and should have been doing. I just want to bring your attention to the fact that before the Syria war was even launched, when we were still in the time of the Iraq war, my party, in our Stop the War movement in Britain, the official Stop the War movement is called the Stop the War Coalition, and we used to be members of that coalition. And at the time that we were members, at the time it was still a big movement. right? I mean, it's become tiny now, and they have the name and they put out emails and that sort of thing. They hold fundraising dinners, but as a mass movement, they've run it into the ground. But at the time, it was still a mass movement, and we at an annual conference of Stop the War back in, I think it was 2010, we took a motion to that conference calling on Stop the War Coalition to adopt a policy of non-cooperation with imperialism's illegal wars. And we set out in that examples of what that could mean. So, for example, we talk about putting on a concert to bring attention to the plight of people who'd been imprisoned for protesting against a Gaza war back in 2008, right? And we said we should raise money and have a campaign to overturn those convictions. They should be freed from jail. It's not right. They're political prisoners. All they've done is there were young people who'd thrown water bottles at the Israeli embassy when Israel was bombing Gaza, right? This was back in 2008. And we said part of our non-cooperation campaign should be freeing these people. We said we should have speaking tours of soldiers to talk about the realities of those wars so that people understand that they have to stop supporting them. We said we need to give full support to all those people like Palestine Action, the groups who came before Palestine Action. There were quite a few of them who were trying to actively stop the production of weapons for these illegal wars. We talked about the need to campaign by army recruitment centers and explain to the kids who are being pulled into the war machine what they're being sent to. And especially we talked about the importance of working inside Britain's trade unions to get each one of them to pass a motion that says these wars are criminal and our members refuse to cooperate in helping them be waged. So that could be refusing to make the weapons, refusing to move munitions and other materials needed by the war machine, refusing to write the propaganda, refusing to broadcast it, do the camera work or upload the stories onto the internet. There's a whole ways, put the newspapers on the shelves in the supermarket, all these ways in which the people are propagandized and softened up for the war, right? And we said, we have to make sure that the war machine just can't operate in our country. We have to force our government onto the retreat. That's our job. Our job is not to stand on the sidelines and say, this person's winning, this person's losing. Oh, it's a shame. Oh, it's because of Syria. It's because of... We have a role because our government can't do what it does without our cooperation. And we have to organize ourselves and withhold that cooperation. And, there's a really important example of this. And I don't think it's a coincidence, Garland, that it happened in the days before there was a Trotskyite movement in the West. But back in 1920, it's a horribly long time ago, but it's a real genuine example of mass working class mobilization and success against war. The British government was one of 14 countries which got together in an alliance to invade Soviet Russia after the revolution. They invaded and they waged a war of intervention, and they backed up the counter-revolutionary white armies in Russia. And they tried to overthrow the new Bolshevik government. And it was the war that the Russian people had to fight against the counter-revolutionary and interventionist forces was much more bloody than the revolution itself. They were really... they tried to strangle them and they tried to drown them in blood. And the Russian people had to fight tooth and nail. And after the end of, 4 years after the revolution, when they finally, defeated that, the country was in absolute ruins. It was, it really put them massively behind where they had been. And they had a huge amount that they then had to try to recover from as a result. During this period, Britain was a leading part of that force coming from outside and trying to overthrow the Russian Revolution. As Winston Churchill at the time said, strangle the Bolshevik baby in its crib. That was his words, right? That was his aim, his government's aim, his class's aim. And the new Communist Party and the predecessors, or the precursor to the Communist Party in 1919 and then 1920, after the Communist Party was formed, they led a mass campaign amongst the organized working class in Britain called the Hands Off Russia campaign. And they said, this is not right, and we must not allow it to continue. And the campaign was so successful and spread so widely amongst the working class, and its popularity was such that, you know, the sympathy that they managed to engender towards the Russian workers who were being attacked by British soldiers and British bombs, British munitions, they managed to create a situation where British dockers refused to load soldiers and materials onto a ship. It's a famous incident called the Jolly George, down in London. And there were other incidents, I think, also up in Glasgow on the Clyde side. And as a result of all of this, the trade union Congress leadership, which was just as rotten then as it is today, right, was just as reluctant to face down the system. But because there was so much pressure from below, they were forced to threaten a general strike. And it was a real threat. And the government knew it was a real threat. And because they knew it was a real threat, they backed off and they withdrew from Russia. And that was because of mobilization of the working class. Britain was forced to pull out, and the British government had to pretend it didn't mean it. And it went on to make some concessions to the working class. It made some pension concessions and some other welfare concessions, because it was very nervous of this hyper-mobilized, angry, militant working class that had the bit between its teeth and was facing them down class to class. Right? This is such an important lesson for us. This is how we defeat the war machine, Garland. It's not by sitting on the side and saying, oh, look, Russia's going to win for us. China's going to make the world multipolar all by itself, and imperialism will just quietly disappear off the stage. Imperialism will not quietly disappear off the stage. Imperialism still has teeth. It might be in decline. It might be, we've talked a lot about the opportunities in this period of crisis because the system is decaying so rapidly from within, but it's swimming in money. And what it can do with that money and its desire to do evil with that money, to maintain its hegemony, is limitless. And right. It will always look for who can be corrupted and who can be used and who can be bribed to do its dirty work. It's weak because it can't easily send its own people to fight its wars, but it's doing a pretty good job of finding proxy forces around the world. And we have to recognize that that is happening. And we have to recognize that we have to play our part in bringing down the system and not sit on the sides and wait for it to happen all by itself and not be suckered into the idea that it's going to happen through, this election or that election. We have to get organized, Garland, and we have to take our responsibilities to our allies seriously. And our allies are not this or that section of the ruling class. Our allies are the people who are fighting on the front lines against imperialism around the world. And for the last 14 years, that was the Syrian people. They were our allies, and we left them in the lurch. And we bear the biggest culpability in what's happened to the Syrian people.
I'll say, we just about out of time, but I one more comment. When you were talking, oh, can you hear me? Let me see. Can you hear me now? No?
Oh, I can't hear you.
That's weird.
You can hear me though, right?
Loud and clear.
It's not me.
That's strange. I can hear you. Can hear you fine. Well, we're just about out of time. I'm just going to do this. We're just about out of time.
Have to finish.
Yeah. Exactly. So we're just about out of time. Apparently, we have lost some kind. It's kind of weird. We can hear Joti fine. She's not hearing me. Who knows? Maybe we said something that really freaked out the people in power. But everyone, as you can see, Joti's website is thecommunists.org. They have a YouTube channel, Proletarian TV. Make sure you go there. Follow Joti Brar also on Telegram and her party on Telegram. Thank you very much. Also share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. We're out.